Okay. All right. So thank you for dropping by and logging in for turns out to be our last class. I had originally set up something next week. For some reason, everything got shifted around because of our holidays and breaks and so on. So this is actually our last class. So what I'd like to do here is to finish up the very last module and then a brief overview of the contents of the second final exam. And so I'll just go through it. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sharing my screen, hopefully. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay. Seems
Yep.
to look
Yep.
okay. Perfect. All right. So these are the slides we would have been looking at this morning. So we'll just start here and basically just kind of start from the beginning and kind of work our way through and pulling all these threads along that we've been sort of laying down along the way, the cables that start at the beginning, and now we're going to sort of pull them taut all the way to the end. And of course, we started with Plato's famous noble lie and the fact that there is the possibility of these, what he calls opportune falsehoods, right? You have a chance to cherry pick the truth or somehow present the best version of a situation that is perhaps not the best. Now, what is important in this is there is this utilitarian viewpoint that Plato takes when lying to the public, or at least asking politicians to consider lying to the public, because it is politically necessary for the state to continue. Now, we saw and we talked about the balance being struck between actively lying to someone for the benefit of the state. That would be this utilitarian greater good motif versus what Castoriadis calls the political imaginary, the ability of us to think up new ideas, new forms of governance, new forms of society, new forms of interaction. So we try to sort of strike this balance between Plato saying that if something doesn't exist, or say something is not real, it doesn't exist, and us saying, well, but what if? What if? So that is something that is a difficulty to maintain, and of course, still today, because we are facing a whole range of different options in terms of the way we live our lives. And as we are allegedly given options, we seem to also be cut back on the number of things we can actually do. The amount of freedoms that we have seem to be curtailed quite a lot. So the question is, what role do noble lies play in uniting and guiding the polis? At the very least, social cohesion. Secondly, are myths needed to give people meaning and purpose? Yes, sometimes the myths are also perennially unattainable. I just heard a commentator yesterday talking about the Republican win in the U.S., how they've, I believe, now have the White House, the House of Representatives, they've got the Senate. So the three branches of government, they have them all. And now there's no one to blame if things go off the rails. You can't turn around, well, it was the Democrats. Well, you're in charge, right? So the myth of having control, for example, is one that perhaps should remain unattainable because it allows us to at least aim high, right? To aspire. But once we achieve that, we're kind of left either with nothing to go forward with or on the edge of an abyss. Hopefully, it's the first, not the second. And finally, the last question I wanted to consider, do noble lies ensure a stable society in contrast to the more skeptical attitude which posits the relentless examination of dangerous truth that might actually undermine society? Well, at the very least, we should have room in society for skepticism and criticism. The issue here is the one brought up by Nietzsche, where he says, okay, we need to be aware that these truths are self-created. There is perhaps no such thing as truth. It's what we do with that knowledge, right? Do we manipulate others into believing that something is when it isn't, or the opposite? If we are aware that we do need certain truths to continue on a day-to-day basis, we end up in a situation where we may sometimes forget that. And Nietzsche reminds us that yes, there should be room for criticism and skepticism, but at the same time, the truth that we are debating, discussing, and trying to make sense of is one that is ultimately just agreed to. Okay, so now, this is one, and I needed a cold shower after reading through this, but the more recent one in the last 100 years is Hitler's noble lie. And this is the big lie, the grobe Lüge, right? This the most grossest misrepresentation of the truth. And again, it is specifically there for political propaganda, right? It is a technique that Hitler discussed in his book Mein Kampf. And he says, look, we can describe how people could be induced to believe so colossal a lie that they would not believe that someone would even dare to distort the truth to such a degree. In other words, lie so outrageously and so provocatively that people would say, there's no way this could be a lie. Like this is nobody would try this. And yet you keep peddling the same outrageous lie over and over again. So finally, it gets normalized, right? This is again what we've seen in American politics since basically 2020. This notion that that elections can be stolen and the system is rigged and there's the deep state and all the rest of it. These are the kinds of gross lies that are sometimes quite easy to knock out through facts, right? The stubborn facts. But the idea, right? The idea takes hold in people's minds and they start to associate things that that's part of their own lives, things that haven't gone their way, frustrations they feel. And the next thing you know, the outrageous lie isn't so outrageous because they can come up with examples. I talked to a guy that talked to a guy that saw this and whatever. But Hitler says, no, you need to lie so outrageously that no one will think that it could possibly be a lie. And this is actually a quote, and a quote from Volume 1, Chapter 3, quote, propaganda is a means and must therefore be judged in relation to the end it is intended to serve. Now, a little bit utilitarian, but in a very specific way, because the difference between what we think of the greater good and propaganda is usually an outright lie, but directed to a segment of the population against another segment. So it is not social cohesion, but social division. So propaganda is a means and must therefore be judged in relation to the end it is intended to serve. It must be organized in such a way as to be capable of attaining its objective. And as it is quite clear that the importance of the objective may vary from the standpoint of general necessity, again, this kind of utilitarian language, the essential internal character of the propaganda must vary accordingly. Germany was waging war for its very existence. The purpose of its war propaganda should have been to strengthen the fighting spirit in their struggle and help it to victory. Not much different than Trump in 2020, standing out there, you've got to fight like hell for your country, or there won't be one left. Same language, different place. So in Mein Kampf is this notion of a deliberate, noble lie, or just a straight up lie, but for propaganda purposes. In other words, for social division rather than cohesion. Then it goes on again. All this was inspired by that principle, which is quite true within itself, that in the big lie, there's always a certain force of credibility. And that's what I meant a moment ago when I said people think about it, mull it over, and then start making these tenuous connections between the lie and what they may have experienced in their own lives. So in the big lie, there's always a certain force of credibility because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. So when we hear MAGA folks, for example, saying that, Trump speaks the truth, what he's speaking is that inner part, right? That almost unconscious part of you that could be racist, sexist, misogynistic, cruel, all those horrible things that we're all capable of. But Hitler says the only way this works is if you tap into that emotional nature. You can present it matter of factly, you can have charts and graphs and whatever, but if you get under their skin, right, you get into those emotional buttons, you're more likely to get us to be successful. So, and thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, wow, okay. So the most basic instinctual, like lizard-like behavior of our minds, the more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to a large-scale falsehood. So there it is from the source's mouth, right? This is the way in which the Nazi Party, through the use of radio, constantly bombarding the population with the same message over and over again. So, okay, hang on here. Okay, so there. So that was kind of the first part of it, the noble lie, and we move on to Francis Bacon. And I think here it might be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll just briefly read through it. This is the other person I think is equally important in this course. Plato's noble lie, and then Francis Bacon's idols of the mind, right? Idols of the tribe, which is ourselves, idols of the cave, which is our education, our connections with other people, our relationships to authority, idols of the theater, which is the whole theatrical spectacle and presentation of philosophical dogmas, theological dogmas, and whether or not we buy into it. And then finally, the idols of the marketplace, right? Us speaking to one another. And sometimes our capacity to use language effectively, but quite often not, right? We end up speaking to people, but sometimes our message doesn't get through. So in the person that we are speaking with or writing to, they kind of fill in the blanks, right? And they can fill in the blanks because they too have subjective tendencies that will sort of plug those holes, say, well, yeah, I think they mean this. Now, regardless, the idols of the mind are very important because we saw how our critical faculties are really part of this, the whole message that I was trying to present in this class. Our critical faculties, that we need to always make sure that the theories that we buy into seem to make sense, right? They're just more right. But what we need to strategize with, right, and against is this sort of simple acceptance. What we should be doing is looking for contrary evidence, which is something that a person does that's in an, in an algorithmic bubble does not, right? They simply find like-minded people. So they seek confirmation in order to break that strategy, or not break the mold, is to look for contrary evidence. And if we can't, the likelihood is what we believe is probably pretty straightforward, pretty true. So we must always be careful of the concepts that we devise to make sense of the natural world. If we can look for opposition or contrary evidence, and we do find it, then we need to consider that in our kind of overall sort of ideas about the world. Now, the idols of the cave, another one we can sort of strategize against, right? Falling into these traps, develop our self-control to slow down our thinking so that we can not only examine the reasons for our beliefs, but also to investigate whether we have good evidence, right? Good reasons to accept them. So this is another way to forge ahead, be mindful of the capability of the idols of the cave to sway us in one way or another. But if we can just slow down a little bit and not accept the first thing that comes along, but not only search for contrary evidence, but look for evidence that can also support it. And then you do kind of a balancing act and decide, yeah, I think this is going to work. So idols of the mind, again, um, we can always be mindful that we should not be fooled by language, by making something real that isn't real. We tend to lie to ourselves to make life easier. Nietzsche pointed that out. Freud pointed that out in psychoanalysis. But we also talked about the culture industry and in Debord's Society of the Spectacle, where advertising and propaganda also try to make something real that isn't. That somehow if we buy a car, we'll have freedom and independence. Yeah, we might, but we're also going to be in the poorhouse because we got to maintain this thing and keep it, fueled with gas and oil and maintenance. So the reality of this dream, right, this myth of freedom and independence, if we're talking about a car, is quite different than the reality of it. So that's another way to be mindful of these things. Now, finally, the idols of the theater. These are theories and concepts and metaphysical, theological, or otherwise, where again, the same thing. We should seek out facts that might contradict those conclusions. And if we do, we need to be ready to change our minds about the beliefs that we've held for a period of time. If we can consider an alternate way of thinking, question those assumptions, those are ways in which we can at least overcome the tendency, because with Bacon, that's what it was. These were tendencies. We can overcome some of these tendencies and be able to be at least aware of how to move about on a day-to-day basis, not be easily confused. So I threw in this little chart here. I think I picked it up from Facebook, which is again how to spot fake news. Sounds kind of familiar. Consider the source. Read beyond it. Check who the author is. Are there supporting sources that will contradict or support that position? Check the date. I tell my communication students, for example, if you're doing any research on a particular topic, always get the most up-to-date material because that's really what you want to be looking at. Also, too, there could be a possibility of it being satire, right? It could have been something shared from a let's say, The Onion or The Daily Show or Stephen Colbert even. Is this a joke? Because if you start looking for sources or reading beyond it, you'll find out pretty quickly what it is. Again, check your own biases, right? If we can question and critically assess our own position, our tendency to sort of easily accept something, then we can be very careful and not allow that to happen. And then finally, peer-reviewed material, asking experts, or at least if we cannot ask them directly, know where we can find that information, then we're less likely to be duped by fake news. Then we talked about Nietzsche a little bit, and as difficult as it is to accept, he did argue that the knowing subject is a conceptual fiction. Now, it's a useful fiction, and this is what he means by sometimes mythologies are okay because they keep everything glued together. It's when we forget that myths glue things together and that the idea of an objective, knowing subject, it's the objectivity, really, more so than the knowing subject. That's the part that is difficult for Nietzsche to accept because we are human beings. We are subjects. We are different people and we come from different places. We have experienced different things. And that's what makes us not the objective individual that you would find in philosophy, but in fact, someone who is, who has an identity. So the knowing subject, this objective person, it's a conceptual fiction, but one that is useful. And truths for Nietzsche are, again, these artificial constructs that serve human purposes. There's a little bit of overlap between Plato's noble lie there and Nietzsche's notion of truth, because it's not a lie. It's not sort of devolving into cowardice. It's actually accepting the fact that yes, these truths serve human purposes. Where we run into trouble is how others manipulate those subjective truths for their own ends, right? Political ends, typically. These truths that are presented to us from those algorithmic bubbles or propaganda that don't serve to cohere society, but to divide it. That's where we have the biggest problem. So what's the first thing we can do? Well, we can stop lying to ourselves about who we are, that we don't always know. In fact, if you go back to ancient Athens, Socrates was the first person to say, I know nothing. I'm asking questions. He admits that he knows nothing. And so by continually asking questions, it's a way of not lying to ourselves, that we walk in knowing everything. If we did, we were born that way, we wouldn't have schools. But if we stop lying to ourselves and become aware that we are sometimes looking for truth that will help us, and there is perhaps a little bit of self-deception, but not to the degree where it would become dangerous. This is not what we're trying to do. Now, there are clear psychological reasons why we may wish to deceive ourselves. There could be anxiety, right? Not knowing the future. There is the need to hold on to a false thought. The what if, like maybe something will change, or even just a desire. So anxiety, need, desires, powerful emotions, right? The things that Hitler is trying to exploit. Those are perhaps some of the reasons why we may entertain truths that are not verifiable, but they kind of work for us, right? They seem to help us on a day-to-day basis. So our ability, our capacity for self-deception is ultimately a coping mechanism, because if we were to restart every single day, hit our default switch and start from ground zero every day, it would be exhausting. No one would leave the house. So there are certain truths that we need to sort of hold on to that will just allow life to be lived. Okay, so that was module 8. Then we went on to Max Weber and charismatic authorities. And here we are sort of moving into the kind of the present day, although let's be clear, Max Weber was writing at the very beginning of the previous century, so the early 1900s, but remarkably was able to not second guess, and he wasn't trying to predict, he wasn't a futurist, he just was looking at trends. And that's what makes these individuals quite remarkable. Looking at trends, he was noticing the possibility within liberal democracy, which is what most of us have experienced, that charismatic authorities obey are obeyed by others for a range of different unusual reasons. The legitimacy, right, of these authorities rests on this belief and a devotion to the extraordinary, and these people are larger than life. They go beyond the normal human qualities. Somehow they almost are bordering on the supernatural. And of course, this summer when Trump, missed being assassinated or survived an assassination attempt, not once but twice, and apparently there was a third one. An Iranian was going to come into the U.S. to try to assassinate Trump. That only exalts him further. And his followers say, yes, we are followers, we are disciples of this person. And so that emotional trigger, that emotional connection with that authority figure becomes even more powerful. So, what are some of the ways in which we can break that? We need to be aware that there are two different types of charismatic leaders. There's the one kind that is an inspiring leader, but we also need to be mindful that there is the dark side, right? A strong and confident leader who dominates the team. Um, if we don't ask questions and we don't question the leader's decisions, there is the possibility that we could go down a very dark path. There is no resistance to this person. And this is, of course, what we're facing right now, because whatever Trump does will literally affect the world, not just the US, the world, because we're already seeing people, politicians in Western Europe, the Ukraine, in South America, ourselves, all of us being, faced with threats of one sort or another, tariffs or otherwise. Uh, we're in a situation where America wishes absolute security for itself at the cost of absolute insecurity for the rest of the world. And that is when a charismatic leader becomes very dangerous. So they're narcissistic, they're manipulative, they're self-focused, self-absorbed, and some of them would just literally just tell you whatever you want to hear or they think you want to hear. So the dark side, right, of charisma, if there's no ethical component in that camp, right, in that cult, we'll say, diverse perspectives, anybody, for example, Hispanics and people of color that voted for Trump are now going to find out the hard way that this guy just wanted your vote and said whatever he knew you wanted to hear. Once he gets into power, he'll do whatever he wishes. And so that is the really dangerous part of charismatic authority. There's also the erosion of due process, right? Because now he and his minions, his moral degenerates, are going to basically go after their political enemies, perceived or not. And those include Republicans, which is going to make it rather messy. But just the erosion of due process, there's no transparency in decision making. Everything is behind closed doors and very, secretive. And all the things that are supposed to be part of the checks and balances of a honest, functioning liberal democracy are now gone. But accountability ultimately is the most important one. And we've seen by winning this election and essentially taking over the Department of Justice, any kind of criminal accountability gone. And what does that do? For the followers, it exalts them even more. So, not good. Ultimately, what is happening is it's a kind of emotional manipulation, which is more Hitler than it is Plato in this case, because eventually the individuals who follow these folks uh, have great difficulty in forming any kind of rational thoughts, because if they do, it's going to be in contrary to what the rest of the cult believes, right? That this guy's got too much power, or like, is he really going to go and deport all these people? It it just boggles the mind of right-thinking people, but within that cult, it makes perfect sense because it's the message they have heard over and over again. So followers become addicted to the leader's charisma and they literally feed off each other. And this is what makes it really dangerous. The next 4 years, I for sure will be interesting, but it'll be interesting to see more than anything else how this MAGA cult continues after Trump is done, if he is in fact done after 4 years, because legally he's not allowed to run a third time. Let's see what happens. Maybe he changes that. So if he can't, it'll be interesting to see what happens to that cult, because they are in a position where once their leader is gone, they have no purpose at this point. So critical thinking processes, I'm going to briefly go through these. These are the things I've just talked about. The identify assumptions, right? So uh, the leaders of the marketplace, leaders of the cave, right? The assumptions that are giving to us. The first thing we need to do is identify them. What are the things that you consider to be moral, all right, to be ethical, to be true? Then check its accuracy or their accuracy and validity. Then look for alternatives. Are there other ways of looking at the same thing? And once you discover those, then you take informed action, which is to continue to believe what you believe to be true, or to change your mind. So that's that sort of circle of critical thinking is one that you can do literally with anything. So identify assumptions, check for validity, consider alternatives. And then once you've honestly and ethically considered all the alternatives, that's when you either continue to go on or you change your mind. So simple, but very effective. Now, we need to also remember that we should not blindly accept what other people say without reason. And we need to be able to question that in terms of our own experiences, our own beliefs. And this is again this notion for Nietzsche to say, the known subject is a fiction. Well, we know what we know because of our personal experiences and the beliefs that we've had for most of our lives. The way in which we marry up those with new ideas that come along, uh, however outrageous they may be, if they just don't have any degree of common sense, the chances are that they're probably not that good. So we need to question them and look for those alternatives. So just as others will not accept our claims and reasons without testing them, neither should we. So instead, right, we need to take this intellectual stance that questions what we believe. And it sounds like a lot of work, but as you go through life and you consider the things that are important to you, your ethical beliefs, what we call a moral backbone, right? What does that actually consist of? What is that moral backbone? Uh, if it is one that you could step out of a cult and still be considered reasonable and normal, you're probably okay. But the moment you step outside of that cult or that algorithmic bubble and realize that, oh, other people don't think that the world is flat, or other people don't think that climate change is fake, those things, that's when you realize that, okay, there's a disconnect here between my intellectual stance with my bubble friends and the rest of the world. So we need to be able to not only think critically about our ideas, but to be able to explain them without at the same time turning into a CD-ROM where we're just spewing out literally verbatim the things that we have read. If we can put it into our own words, in other words, internally process these ideas and adopt them to our language, if they still make sense, there's some validity to it. But if you can only explain something using the exact verbiage and the exact words that the person that's told you this or where you've read it, that could be something wrong with that message, right? That you can't break it down into anything other than just a word salad. And trust me, there will be lots of word salads that are coming up the next month or so, as various people who are in the U.S. who are about to run, very important departments, whether it's the DOJ or the FBI or Homeland Security, they'll be full of word salads that if you stop and parse it out, you'll realize, okay, this is just garbage, right? It's just a bunch of words that have really no meaning, no sense. So a sound argument has at its roots a series of provable assertions and facts presented as evidence. If there isn't, then you should ask yourself, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that the following is true? And yes, depending on the cult and its particular nature, they usually tell you with F your facts, and we're just going to keep doing this because we want to quote unquote own the libs, whatever it may be. But if you want to own the libs by burning down America, wow, that's a tall order. So a sound argument should have assertions and facts that can be proven. And if there are, it's worth considering. If they're missing, maybe not so. Okay, so one of the things I want to sort of wrap up here with is a distinction between different statements, right? A fact, an inference, and an opinion. Sounds fairly straightforward. Now we keep talking about facts. Now, what is that? A fact is a statement with a high degree of certainty through data testing, verifiable data testing, through the laws of nature, through the laws of cause and effect, scientific experimenting, whatever it may be. But the truth claim has a very high degree of certainty because it has been tested. Now, from that, we go down to an inference. Now, an inference, right, infers something. It's an informed interpretation of events or hypothesis that could be based on fact. So let's say I look outside, and maybe now right now because my driveway's under 1.5 feet of snow, but let's say I see a little pile of oil, right? There's a little blob of oil there. Well, I can look at that and go, well, a car was probably parked there within the last 12 hours. And why can I say that? Because I'm inferring that the car is there, because I have the evidence of a leaky oil pan right there in my driveway. So there is some factual evidence that tells me that something may have occurred at a certain point. Or even something very simple. Go outside and you see footprints in the snow, there's your evidence. Someone walked by here a very short time ago because these prints look fresh. So you're inferring information based on some factual evidence. Now, the least effective strategy for critical thinking is an opinion. And that's a subjective belief, a value judgment that may or may not be supported by verifiable facts. Um, you know, it's, I don't know if it's true, but I just think, or I don't think if whatever the idea is that you have, we need to be careful that we're not presenting opinions, because opinions are simply the first step, right, towards a fact. But if it cannot be supported by facts in any way, and they're just ideas, right? Stereotypical ideas, prejudicial ideas, misinformation, quick generalizations, any of those things, they fall into the category of opinion. So, as much as possible, as we're thinking through things, let's always try to go for facts, or at the very least, an inference. So, one of the things that I talk about in my critical thinking class, and I'm just going to borrow this one slide here from there, is this thing called abductive thinking. Now, in philosophy, there are two different types of thinking. There is inductive and deductive. Deductive is you strip away all the doubt until you end up with one factual statement. The inductive one is you test and test and test until you decide you can make one general statement, always willing to be knocked down and changed. But abductive thinking is a kind of a combination of both of them, because it's one in which we're able to sort of at least work through life. And abductive thinking is something where we formulate a hypothesis about something which has occurred, and then we try to test it, right? We go out and we look for information. And if we think abductively, we are less likely to fall into these cognitive biases, because we're always trying to think otherwise, right? We've got a hypothesis which typically leans towards the truth, but if we are mindful of the evidence that we have, the hypothesis that we formulate from it, and we're willing to sort of engage in a kind of dialogue between the facts as they present themselves, our initial idea or hypothesis, how it changes, and if we are also aware of the cognitive biases that Francis Bacon had talked to us about, um, thinking that our own judgments are always correct, failing to actively seek out objective facts, blaming others, assuming that everyone shares the same opinion, using mental shortcuts, never good, trusting someone more based because of their perceived authority, charismatic figure, for example, or attributing other people's success to simply luck or external factors. These are the kind of cognitive biases that Francis Bacon had talked about, but they also matter to us today, because there is that tendency to, fall into one of these biases, and never good. So, if we think about critical thinking, and we have always that possibility of fooling ourselves, right? We're looking for that truth claim that is easier. All right, our common way of thinking is that we have proof when all we have to back up our claim is yet another firmly held belief. So we end up with a situation where we need to find something else to prove that first belief, and what we find behind it is yet another belief, right? We seem to we seem to have facts sort of moving towards a horizon too quickly, and we don't have any factual evidence to begin to formulate a more reasonable hypothesis as it moves towards, some kind of truth. So that diagram right there, starting from a hypothesis to a deduction, right? Stripping down everything that is possibly wrong or could be doubted. And then from there, making a prediction. I think it may be X or Y. Then you observe, right? You observe and you look and you test. And then from there, you can move into the inductive phase. So the two typical movements in philosophy, deductive and inductive, the abductive one uses both of them. So it uses the best of both. So you start with an idea, you formulate a possible cause of something, and you test, observe, and continue to test and observe or read for more factual information until finally you say, I can make a general statement. That can be changed, which may lead to a further hypothesis. So sounds like a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it when you don't want to be lied to. So the one true principle, this notion that is again a hypothetical one, right? The matter is more complex than it seems. That the principle may be partially true, like we can grasp only some of it. Even philosophers going as far back as Aristotle, who warned us, right? It looks like the truth is simple to grasp, but in fact, we can never grasp all of it together. The totality of this truth, quote unquote, things are often much more complex. Now, because of that, we end up sort of falling on hypotheses that are easier, quicker, and then because it sounds like, yeah, I think this could be it, then we typically try to double down on it, right? Rather than looking for alternatives. And that's what we have to we have to make sure that we do. We look for those alternatives. Okay, so again, the same sort of circular pattern of observing and questioning, looking for an area where there is going to be peer-reviewed research. We formulate a hypothesis as to what we think we're going to be talking about. We test through experimentation and verification, observation. We analyze our data, and then we report our conclusions. And those conclusions could formulate other questions because the kind of this question answer complex is one that may raise as many new questions as it answers old ones. That's not a bad thing. That's critical thinking. That's what that is. So we can start with a plausible working hypothesis and work all the way around and say, look, have I found enough information? Is there some data that could disprove my idea? What prove me wrong because I have inherent biases? So even if we try to gather evidence on both sides, we still tend to favor that original hypothesis because it was the first one we started with, right? Everything always evolves back or falls back on that one. That's one of the things that we try to do or we tend to do, but we should try to refrain from it. And the other one is we may try to double down or hunker down on a claim through either overconfidence, which is, again, it's a human trait. So notice all the strategies that I've described are ones that would actually support what Nietzsche has said, right? The knowing subject is a fiction. Doesn't mean it's non-existent. It means it's a fiction. Struggling to learn and struggling to know and struggling to grasp the truth sometimes can be hard work. But these are some strategies that would allow us to get there. So yes, Nietzsche may or may not be wrong or right. The knowing subject may or may not be a truth. But if we're looking at this, we say, okay, well, this is at least one way to get closer to knowing something. So if we're aware that these are the kinds of tendencies that we fall under, we just need to be really careful. So finally, we've talked about discourse, misinformation, and disinformation. Once again, the same sort of thing. Consider the solutions that we are thinking of. Imagine something that can refute or contradict our hypothesis. If we can't refute that evidence, what are the possibilities that we can continue the research in its present state, right? What needs to change? We try to gather data objectively. And remember, Nietzsche says, well, we'd like to, we try to. But if you ask yourself, what would I see in this if I opposed my solution or claim? That's an awareness that sometimes being objective isn't always, we like to think we are, right? We lie to ourselves that we are, but instead, let's look for something that could refute it as much again, as much as we'll support it, but don't dismiss information that will contradict it. Consider it, right? Formulate an idea. So if we can gather and interpret data objectively, or at least to the best of our abilities, we may not fall into this trap uh, regarding misinformation. And again, nothing wrong with gathering more information that we need so we have absolute confirmation. Okay, so those were the slides that I wanted to present to you. And the only thing that is left at this point, I don't think, I'm trying to remember if I went to our, okay, no, it didn't go to our, okay, so share, I don't want to share. Just don't want to close. There we go. Okay, so the only thing I wanted you to have a look at for the last module is I cut out a lot of the material that were just articles and so on. A couple of different things to look at. The issues that we've discussed in the course before regarding sort of alternative voices in North America and in the US in particular, because I've mentioned how right-wing media have pervaded, right, television, podcasts, the internet, radio, it's everywhere. And there are specific reasons why left-wing podcasts and left-wing media centers are very sparse, because of corporate media. If you are funding something, a particular media outlet, let's say radio or television station, if you are willing to criticize and you have to go all in, you may end up criticizing the very company that is supporting you, or a company that does business with your supporter. So there's economic conflicts, right? Conflicts of interest between capitalism and a left-wing media, right? Because corporate media is part of the capitalist system, it is very difficult to maintain that kind of voice. Now, on YouTube, lots and lots of information, various podcasts are out there, but it will never reach the level of the pervasiveness of right-wing media for just that reason, because the capitalist interests and the corporations fund these voices because it benefits them, right? I'm not saying it's a noble lie. It just, right-wing media and capitalism fit well together because one supports the other. Left-wing media, much, much more difficult. Now, there's print, and there's some podcasters and so on that are out there, but by comparison, they're very, very few. And then the very last one I'd like to have a look at is like 2 minutes long. It's actually the editor of Mother Jones, which is, I believe, if not the only, one of the very few left-leaning journals or magazines, monthly magazines out of the US. And the editor says, I can reduce the Trump's election win to 2 words: wealth inequality. And once again, it taps into the same thing. And he holds up a chart that says, okay, here is the median for the average household. Here are the multimillionaires, and here are the billionaires. And when you see it, it is incredible what happens, because the 1% literally is a straight line skyward, and everyone else is left behind. So yeah, that's the reality of it. How it's couched and how it's presented to Americans and the rest of the world is in the fondest of terms and the most positive terms, but that's the reality, right? That there are people that are doing insanely well, making truckloads of money by the minute, and many of us are not, right? And many people are not. They're in that median line that barely moves. And the editor says, okay, so that's that. Then there is a Democratic Party that keeps promising to do things and never falls through, and there's frustration. So people leave that party. And in the last one, which I think is the most important one, is the one he says, if the system is broken, I'm going to vote to have it burned to the ground and see what happens. That's scary. And I have a feeling that that could be something that has motivated many people to vote for Trump. He made it very clear what he wants to do. So yes, the next 4 years are going to be, well, interesting. Again, it's the only way I can say it. I don't want to say dangerous. There are checks and balances, but I think the checks and balances are now on a global scale rather than strictly within America. And that's still a good thing, because I don't know quite what's going to happen at this point. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to point that out. What's left right now for the course, I believe, is just I'm not sure whether the last module tests were finished this past Sunday or this Sunday. Yeah, so yeah, the first or the eighth. Have a look at that. If you haven't done it, please complete it. And the only thing that's now left to finish is the second test, the final, and that'll cover the second half of the course. So from Nietzsche up to the Debord and the Society of the Spectacle. So again, open book test, same structure. There'll be 20 sort of identify and explain questions. Pick 5 and just briefly describe what they are, if there are any thinkers associated with it or where it's used, anything to generate those 3 marks. And then the second half, there'll be 5 module questions. And again, open book. Tell me in your words, what you think of these ideas. And for sure, if what I've presented, let's say regarding Nietzsche or the spectacle, if you disagree with it, let me know. Tell me, because I'm presenting this information to you for your consideration. I am simply the conveyor of information. I'm the messenger, we'll say, but I definitely want to know your ideas, right? Not your opinions, but your ideas, because those ideas are based in factual evidence, right? You've read the material, you've gone through the slides, you may have clicked on a couple of the PDFs, so you've got some knowledge, right? You're not sort of blindly sort of thinking about these things. You're reflecting on it. So even if it's by way of not contradiction, but criticism, absolutely. That's what I'm also looking for. Um, that's pretty well it. That is the end of the course, and we finished in under an hour. I'm glad. Once again, thank you very much for logging in and taking this course in the first place. I've appreciated you sort of your input and your material. I'm looking forward to reading the final versions of your papers. If you have not submitted your draft, right, which is the paper in its present state, if it's not finished, please do so, because I've noticed that a few students haven't, and I wanted to make sure that everyone gets their marks. So in the meantime, I tough it out with the weather. It's not the nicest out there. And yes, the school is closed, but I appreciate you all logging in. And I will post this on YouTube, and I'm also going to post a link in the new announcements page. So if you want to go back and refer to it and some of the material that I've talked about, by all means, go back and have a look at it. And so this is pretty well it. So thank you so much for dropping by and for taking the course. And hopefully we'll see each other in the new year and under different conditions with a lot less snow, I would hope. But in the meantime, have a great break, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in the new term. Bye-bye.
Thank you.